The small, sealed letter lay on the table, its wax seal perfectly intact. Henry VIII, the King of England, stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. Around him, the grand halls of his palace echoed with the whispers of courtiers, all of whom knew the letter's contents could shatter the kingdom. Katherine of Aragon, Henry's wife of nearly 2 decades, had received the document from Rome. It was a papal dispensation, a letter that declared her marriage to Henry valid, despite her brief marriage to Henry's older brother, Arthur. Henry, however, refused to accept it. He clung to a desperate hope. If no one formally acknowledged the letter, it might as well not exist. But Katherine, a woman of fierce pride and unwavering faith, would not let it go. She had heard about Henry's state of denial from Eustace Chapuys, the Imperial ambassador. Chapuys, a shrewd and cunning diplomat, had long been Katherine's confidant. He reported everything to Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and Katherine's powerful nephew. Katherine decided to confront Henry. She marched into the royal chamber, the letter clutched in her hand, and demanded a meeting. Henry, caught off guard, tried to avoid her, but she was relentless. "You must see this, my lord," she said, her voice steady. "This proves my marriage to you is lawful." Henry's face grew pale. He knew the letter's contents could undermine his entire plan to annul the marriage and marry Anne Boleyn, a young and ambitious lady in waiting. "Katherine, this is a forgery," he stammered. "The seal is in the wrong place, and the signature is different from the ones we know." Katherine's eyes narrowed. "You lie, Henry. You know this document is real. You are using this as an excuse to cast me aside and marry Anne, but the truth will prevail." Henry's supporters, desperate to back their king, began gathering evidence to prove the letter was a forgery. They claimed the wax seal was misplaced, and the handwriting of the papal secretary was different from other documents. But their arguments were weak, and they knew it. Chapuys, in a letter to Charles, wrote, "They make much here of this brief of dispensation, fancying that if they only succeed in having it condemned as a forgery, which they never will do, they will ultimately gain their point. Hitherto, they have adduced no sound proof against its authenticity, and I am really astonished how they can be so quiet about it when the Queen herself has declared by a public act that she could not publicly avow or make use of the brief in her defense, inasmuch as it is explicitly said therein that Prince Arthur, her former husband, had consummated matrimony, a claim she declares to be untrue, as her present husband has often confessed before witnesses." Henry, now cornered, refused to confirm or deny whether Katherine had been a virgin when they married. He claimed that her virginity or lack thereof was not the point. Katherine, however, knew better. Her entire defense rested on her claim that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, making her a virgin when she wed Henry. Chapuys, who had been in England for years, was a master of intelligence. Despite his initial struggles with the English language, he had built a vast network of informants. He dined with powerful courtiers like Thomas Cromwell and Brian Tuke, Henry's secretary, and cultivated relationships with foreign merchants who provided him with vital information. His household staff, including his secretary Juan de Montoya and his Flemish servant, were also his eyes and ears. Chapuys was careful not to appear too often at court, using his gout and a reputation for being sullen and lazy as cover. He sent his trusted aides to gather information, and they returned with details of court gossip and political maneuvers. His network extended beyond England, with Italian bankers and Flemish merchants keeping him informed of financial and military matters. As 1529 drew to a close, Chapuys witnessed the fall of Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's chief minister, and the rising power of the Boleyn family. Wolsey's enemies, including Thomas More, Thomas Boleyn, and the Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk, presented a disabling bill of 44 articles against him. The French ambassador, Jean du Bellay, regretted Wolsey's fall, as it meant the loss of a pro-French ally in the English court. Du Bellay wrote that Anne Boleyn had made Henry promise never to give Wolsey a fair trial, seeing him as a threat to her ambitions. Katherine's situation worsened as Henry and Charles V signed a peace treaty on 28 November 1529. While Katherine was pessimistic, Chapuys believed Henry was eager to maintain peace to avoid further financial strain and potential rebellion. Henry had already spent over 800,000 ducats supporting Charles's campaign against France, leaving the treasury depleted. On 1 December 1529, the bill against Wolsey was presented, and his enemies wasted no time in securing his downfall. The custom house guards even searched Cardinal Campeggio's trunks as he left for Rome, but found nothing of Wolsey's. By the end of the year, Wolsey was ruined, the Boleyns were in power, and Catherine's reign as Queen of England was coming to an end. Chapuys, now a major player at court, understood the complex web of politics and personal vendettas. He was a man of hard-headed realism, cynical disillusionment, and a deep sympathy for the victims of injustice. He would soon find himself in the thick of the most dramatic and dangerous events of Henry VIII's reign. Katherine of Aragon's life was a series of ups and downs, shaped by the political games of kings and the will of fate. In 1503, she was betrothed to Arthur, Prince of Wales, securing a powerful alliance between Spain and England. But tragedy struck when Arthur died unexpectedly, leaving Katherine in a difficult position. Her dowry became a point of contention between her father, King Ferdinand of Aragon, and her father-in-law, King Henry VII of England. This made Katherine a pawn in a game of diplomacy, but her betrothal to Arthur's brother Henry eventually restored the alliance and her status. Katherine was known for her beauty and grace, and she quickly won the hearts of the English people. However, her marriage to Henry VIII was not to last. Henry, captivated by Anne Boleyn, sought to annul his marriage to Katherine. This decision required a papal dispensation, which had been granted because of a possible consummation of Katherine's first marriage. This papal decision would later cause significant conflict. Eustace Chapuys, the Imperial ambassador, became a staunch supporter of Katherine. He saw her not just as a queen but as a person, someone who was passionate and deeply human. Chapuys was tasked with defending Katherine's rights, and he took this mission to heart, sometimes going beyond his diplomatic duties. He was deeply loyal to Katherine and her daughter, Mary, and he never forgave Henry and Anne for their treatment of them. At first, Chapuys was optimistic about Katherine's chances. She was beloved by the people and the court, and the conservative nature of the English seemed to favor her. However, in January 1530, Henry ordered Katherine to leave the court and reside in Richmond. Despite this, Katherine continued to fight for her rights, writing letters and using her public appearances to challenge Henry. At a feast in December 1529, she publicly reproached Henry for his neglect, which only made him more determined to push through the divorce. Henry's determination was fueled by his desire to marry Anne Boleyn, and his growing impatience with the Pope's refusal to grant the annulment. He even threatened to denounce the Pope as a heretic if his demands were not met. Anne, feeling the pressure of time and the uncertainty of her position, was equally frustrated. She openly criticized Henry, warning him that he might one day return to Katherine and cast her aside. Meanwhile, Cardinal Wolsey, once Henry's most trusted advisor, found himself in a precarious position. His failure to secure the annulment led to a falling out with the king. Wolsey's illness in January 1530 provided a brief moment of sympathy from Henry, but the Boleyn faction, including Anne, saw it as an opportunity to undermine Wolsey's influence. Despite their efforts, Henry eventually pardoned Wolsey, allowing him to retain some of his wealth and titles. Chapuys, a keen observer, noted that Wolsey's survival was a testament to his political skills and connections. As Wolsey's influence waned, two new figures emerged, Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell. Cranmer, a theologian, suggested that the divorce issue should be treated as a theological question rather than a legal one. He proposed that Henry seek the opinions of scholars across Europe on the validity of his marriage to Katherine. Cromwell, a skilled lawyer and political advisor, took a more radical approach. He advised Henry to assert his authority over the Church in England, effectively breaking away from Rome. Chapuys had complex relationships with these new players. He respected Cranmer's intelligence and theological insights, but was wary of Cromwell's political ambitions. In January 1530, Chapuys had his first audience with Henry for the year. The meeting was a mix of formalities and subtle power plays. Henry greeted Chapuys warmly, inviting him to visit the court more often. Chapuys, always aware of the political dynamics, noted the presence of key figures like Norfolk and Thomas Boleyn, who were known to favor the French. Henry's choice of Thomas Boleyn to lead an embassy to Bologna, where Charles V and the Pope were meeting, was a calculated move. Thomas was a skilled diplomat, but Chapuys saw his involvement as problematic due to his family ties to Anne. The mission ultimately failed, with Charles refusing to meet Thomas. This setback only fueled Henry's resolve to pursue a different path. Cranmer was sent to Rome to gather evidence, while George Boleyn, Anne's brother, was sent to France to canvass scholarly opinions. Despite the French ambassador's dismissive attitude towards George, Chapuys recognized his potential and commended his candor. The political landscape was shifting, and Henry's advisors were exploring every avenue to achieve their goals. Throughout February, Henry and his advisors met frequently with the French ambassadors, leading Chapuys to suspect that a significant treaty was being negotiated. The diplomatic intrigue was intense, and Chapuys used every means to gather information. One particularly dramatic moment involved Norfolk delivering a document with a gold seal to the French ambassador, only to take the document back and replace it with another. Chapuys, ever the keen observer, pieced together the details from his conversations with the French ambassador, Guillaume du Bellay. As the political chess game continued, Catherine's supporters, including Chapuys, remained steadfast in their defense of her rights. The battle over the annulment was far from over, and the stage was set for a dramatic and tumultuous period in English history. Chapuys, the Imperial ambassador, was growing increasingly suspicious of the French and Henry VIII's growing alliance against Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. He wrote to Charles, questioning the removal of a seal from a document, wondering if it was being replaced. Chapuys, always cautious, explained that he preferred to provide more details than to be accused of negligence, even if some information seemed unnecessary. Charles appreciated these detailed reports, especially the ones about Cardinal Wolsey, who had been sidelined from power and was now trying to regain influence. Wolsey, once a powerful figure in Henry's court, saw an opportunity to return to favor by aligning with Charles. He believed that if he could help Charles, he might also find a way to end the divorce proceedings and restore Queen Katherine to her position. Wolsey used his physician, Agostino Agostini, to reach out to Chapuys, asking for a Spanish pension and the bishopric of Palencia. Chapuys was intrigued but cautious, knowing that Wolsey, now out of power, could not provide much useful information. Meanwhile, the Duke of Norfolk, a key figure at court, was caught between his loyalty to Queen Katherine and the growing influence of the Boleyn faction. Norfolk, a devout Catholic and pro-imperialist, was a valuable ally for Katherine. However, he and his faction were willing to sacrifice her, if it meant securing a French alliance. Chapuys tried to keep Norfolk on the imperial side, emphasizing that Norfolk had always acted loyally toward the Queen, and could be a strong ally to Charles. Chapuys often found himself in heated debates with Henry VIII, who was known for interrupting and contradicting the ambassador. Henry, frustrated by Chapuys' legal expertise and calm demeanor, would often bluster and become emotional. Chapuys, however, remained composed, often out, maneuvering the king in these intellectual spars. Henry's attempts to lecture Chapuys on the law were met with the ambassador's cool suggestion that they consult the king's own counsel, confident that they would agree with him. The issue of the university's opinions on the divorce was a significant point of contention. Henry believed that the support of the English universities and the Sorbonne would solidify his case. However, Chapuys suspected that the commissioners sent to canvass these institutions were using violent or coercive methods to secure endorsements. In a meeting with Henry, Chapuys confronted the king about these allegations, which Henry denied. Chapuys then provided a detailed report of the incidents, which he also sent to Miguel May, the emperor's agent in Rome, in case the evidence was needed. Norfolk, present at the meeting, tried to reassure Chapuys that the learned doctors advocating for the divorce were reputable. However, Chapuys turned the tables by persuading a student from Paris to criticize the doctor's behavior and support the Queen's cause. Norfolk, feeling the pressure, urged Chapuys to continue supporting an imperial alliance and asked what Charles would do if Henry married Anne Boleyn. Chapuys, trying to ease the tension, flattered Norfolk, suggesting that he should have led the embassy to Bologna instead of Thomas Boleyn. The arrival of the new French ambassador, Jehan Jacquin, added another layer of complexity. Chapuys, distrustful of the French, took an immediate dislike to Jacquin, believing he would cause trouble. Chapuys maintained his cautious approach with Wolsey, who was desperate to regain favor with Charles. Wolsey urged Charles to take military action against Henry, and to support the Queen's demand for the Pope to order Henry to remove Anne from court. Henry, meanwhile, was working to secure the support of the nobles and the Pope. He planned to have them write to the Pope, arguing the necessity of the divorce and warning of the consequences if the Pope refused. Chapuys, now viewed as a troublemaker by Henry and his counselors, faced increasing obstacles. When he tried to meet with Brian Tuke, a messenger told him that the king no longer favored the ambassador. Tuke, however, hinted that he would only meet Chapuys if the pay was good, revealing his true motivation. On June 15th, Chapuys wrote a provocative letter to Charles, urging him to put pressure on the Pope to demand that Henry send Anne away from court. Chapuys was encouraged by the fact that Henry still maintained a domestic relationship with Catherine, which led to a heated argument when Anne discovered that Henry had sent Catherine cloth to make his shirt. Anne, furious, threatened to punish the servant who delivered the cloth, but Henry quickly admitted that he had ordered it. The tension between the factions at court continued to rise, with Chapuys playing a crucial role in navigating the complex political landscape and supporting Queen Katherine's cause. Catherine and those close to her hoped the argument over shirts would drive a wedge between Anne and Henry, but Chapuys, the Spanish ambassador, reported something different. He said the couple was spending the entire summer together, forgetting their roles as king and mistress. The king was showing more affection to Anne, even letting her ride behind him on a pillion, which shocked many people. Despite the scandal, Chapuys noted that the argument had only brought them closer. The only thing that could separate them, he believed, was the Pope. In late October, a papal brief reached Henry, forbidding him from remarrying and ordering him to dismiss Anne Boleyn. This news hit hard, and Henry's anger was directed at Cardinal Wolsey. It was discovered that Wolsey had been secretly dealing with foreign powers. In November 1530, Henry sent William Walsh and Henry Percy to arrest Wolsey on charges of high treason. Chapuys, wanting to distance himself from the fallen cardinal, reported that Wolsey was accused of trying to regain his power and corrupt the people. However, Chapuys also noted that Henry quickly regretted losing his most trusted advisor, saying, "The cardinal was a very different man from any of them for conducting state matters." The Boleyns, sensing the danger, acted swiftly. Anne confronted Henry, crying and pleading that she must leave him. Henry, desperate to keep her, begged her to stay in a way that seemed undignified for a king. Anne's tactics worked, and Wolsey was ordered to be brought to the Tower of London. However, Wolsey fell ill on the journey and died at Leicester Abbey. On his deathbed he said, "If I had served God as diligently as I have done the king, he would not have given me over in my gray hairs." This was a poignant statement from a man who had been Henry's loyal servant. Chapuys detailed Wolsey's last days, noting that Wolsey died on St. Andrew's Day, about 40 miles from London. He protested his innocence and loyalty to the king, even as he received the Holy Sacrament. Wolsey was buried in the same church as Richard III, and people began to call it the Tyrant's Grave. Chapuys did not speculate on whether Henry mourned Wolsey, but he noted that Henry would take control of Wolsey's considerable wealth. There was one more loose end: Wolsey's physician, Agostino Agostini, who had carried letters between Wolsey and Chapuys. Henry's council suspected a relationship between Wolsey and Chapuys, and Agostini was interrogated. Fortunately for Chapuys, the physician denied knowing the ambassador. Chapuys was confident that Agostini would not confess, as Norfolk, who couldn't keep secrets, would have warned him if Agostini had said anything incriminating. Throughout 1530, Chapuys maintained frequent contact with Norfolk, but had not seen Thomas Boleyn since his return from Italy. When Chapuys visited Norfolk in late October, he unexpectedly ran into Thomas. The relationship between the two men had clearly soured. Thomas, still upset about his failed embassy to Bologna, vented his frustration to Chapuys, blaming Charles and the Pope for his troubles. Chapuys was taken aback and quickly distanced himself from the situation. He reported the incident to Charles, concerned that Thomas and Anne's influence at court could alienate England from the Pope. In November, Chapuys and Thomas clashed again over a proposal to reform the church. Chapuys began to suspect that Thomas and Anne were Lutherans, a term he used for anyone whose faith wasn't completely orthodox. With Wolsey gone, Chapuys was worried about Catherine's cause. William Warham, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was supposed to defend Catherine, was ineffective and even detrimental. Warham had drawn up documents suggesting he should preside over the divorce case, which Chapuys correctly suspected would not be in Catherine's favor. Chapuys described Warham as timid and unreliable, a constant disappointment. Chapuys' frustration grew as Charles focused elsewhere. The Pope was ineffective, and Warham betrayed Katherine. In a rare outburst, he vented to Nicholas Perronat de Granvelle, Charles's secretary, and to Charles himself, complaining that the Pope had been indecisive and that Henry no longer cared what the Pope thought. Henry saw Warham as a way out of the divorce crisis, and instructed his agents to insist that the proceedings be transferred to Warham's jurisdiction. Chapuys tried to prevent this by urging the papal nuncio to visit Warham, but Warham refused to defy Henry. Katherine needed support from Rome, and Chapuys wrote to Charles, urging the Pope to threaten Henry with excommunication. He suggested that this would make it difficult for England to trade with Flanders and Spain, increasing the people's discontent. Charles, however, was not interested in military action. Feeling powerless, Chapuys considered leaving England, but Katherine begged him to stay. She said she needed his help more than ever. Chapuys agreed to stay, though he acknowledged that he could do little without Charles's support. One small glimmer of hope came in the form of Bishop John Fisher, who supported Katherine and refused to back Henry in the legatine court. Fisher was a strong opponent of the divorce, and insisted on adding a clause to Henry's new title as supreme head of the Church, limiting it to what Christ allowed. Chapuys and Fisher began to communicate secretly, and Fisher urged Charles to take action, comparing it to a holy war against the Turks. Even in death, Wolsey could not escape the Boleyns' scorn. In January 1531, Thomas Boleyn invited Claude de la Guiche, the new French ambassador, to dinner. The main event was a play about Wolsey going to hell. La Guiche was horrified and blamed Thomas and Norfolk for the offensive performance. Chapuys, who was in touch with La Guiche, reported that the Frenchman was openly disdainful of the Boleyns. Anne adopted a motto, Ainsi sera groigni qui groigni, meaning that's how it will be, let those who grumble, grumble. The motto was derided and became a subject of jokes, but Chapuys stayed silent. Anne suspected Chapuys was keeping Katherine informed, so she banned Katherine's regular courtiers from attending her. Later, Chapuys was deceived by Henry, who summoned him to a private meeting while Anne spied on them from a window. Anne's influence over Henry was clear, and it shocked Chapuys. Chapuys continued his routine negotiations, but was deeply burdened by the injustice to Katherine and Mary. He saw his role as their defender, and was convinced that Henry's government needed to be overthrown. On January 8, 1531, Chapuys informed Henry of the death of Margaret of Austria, and asked who would represent England at her funeral. Chapuys was emotional, having admired Margaret, and was surprised by Henry's light-hearted response. Henry was more interested in who would succeed Margaret in the Low Countries. Chapuys was evasive, and Henry moved on. Later that evening, Chapuys visited Katherine to reassure her that he had not discussed her affairs with Henry. Katherine and Chapuys had a close relationship. She relied on him as her window to the outside world, and he was her sounding board. They supported each other, with Katherine often rallying Chapuys when he felt despair. The presence of more French ambassadors at court made Chapuys uneasy. He reported that the French were in constant communication with the English, which worried him. The Boleyns' influence was growing, and Chapuys felt the need to protect Katherine and her daughter, Mary, more than ever. As the political storm around Henry VIII's quest for a divorce raged on, Eustace Chapuys, the Spanish ambassador, found himself at the center of a complex web of alliances and rivalries. His fears grew when he noticed that the French ambassadors were receiving more attention from King Henry at court, often snubbing Chapuys and other foreign envoys. This shift in Henry's favor towards the French was a clear sign that the king's priorities were changing, and Chapuys suspected that the French ambassador, Jehan Joquin, was being sent to Rome with a secret mission. Joquin was rumored to be on his way to the Vatican to revive marriage negotiations between the Pope's niece and one of the sons of the King of France, but Chapuys believed his true purpose was to obstruct the General Council from considering Henry's divorce. At the same time, the relationship between Henry and Anne Boleyn was under constant scrutiny. It seemed that the divorce issue would never reach a conclusion, and Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, worried that Henry's growing frustration might push him to marry Anne regardless of the Pope's decision. Chapuys, however, reassured Charles that Henry would not proceed with a de facto marriage, confident that the king would be swayed by the concerns of his council. But Katherine of Aragon, Henry's wife, knew her husband better. She was surprised by Chapuys' incredulity, and believed that Henry's private desires could override his public stance. Catherine's proctor, Dr. Pedro Ortiz, who was as dedicated to her cause as Chapuys, was ordered to leave court by the Duke of Norfolk. This move was clearly meant to keep Ortiz away from the next sessions of Parliament, where he would have tried to obstruct the proceedings. Ortiz was bewildered and angry, but Chapuys understood the political maneuvering behind the order. On January 11th, Chapuys reported that Henry had received letters from Rome which greatly angered him and Anne. The Pope had threatened Henry with excommunication if he entered a second marriage before the existing one was decided. Norfolk, tasked with explaining the situation to Chapuys, took the ambassador into a secret chapel for a private meeting. Norfolk, known for his melodramatic tendencies, warned Chapuys that the Pope's actions were merely to please Queen Katherine. Chapuys, however, remained calm and used Norfolk's past praise of Princess Mary to remind the Duke of the princess's virtues and her importance to the realm. Chapuys and Norfolk's conversation was a complex and convoluted affair, reflecting the deep divisions and tensions at the heart of Henry's court. Norfolk tried to defend Henry's right to rule as an absolute master in his kingdom, emphasizing that kings were above popes. Chapuys, ever the skilled diplomat, pointed out that Charles V, as a ruler of multiple kingdoms, had an even greater need for male heirs. He also reminded Norfolk of his past statements about the legitimacy of Henry's throne through the female line, specifically through Mary's grandmother, Elizabeth of York. As the year progressed, the political landscape continued to shift. The papal nuncio, on Chapuys' advice, had an audience with Henry in late May. Henry, furious with the Pope's inaction, declared that the Pope was afraid of the Emperor and dared not act against his wishes. Henry then offered to send the nuncio a newly printed book, hoping to sway the Pope's opinion. Chapuys, however, had already obtained a copy and sent it to his allies to prepare for any political challenges. By this time, Chapuys had become an unofficial leader of the Aragonese faction, a group opposed to Henry's divorce and his growing ties with Anne Boleyn. He had formed a network of spies and allies, including Bishop Fisher and Thomas More, who were openly against Henry's actions. Despite the increasing hostility from the court, Chapuys remained steadfast in his support for Katherine and her cause. His position became even more tenuous as he was seen as a troublemaker by Henry, but he continued to visit the Queen and provide her with legal assistance and advice. In May 1531, the king, queen, and mistress were still under one roof for all religious occasions. Henry's mood swung from day to day, depending on whom he spent his time with. One evening, Katherine and Henry discussed their daughter Mary's health, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if Anne had never been. The next morning, however, Henry's reaction to Katherine's request to allow Mary to visit was a stark contrast to the previous night. This incident highlighted the volatile nature of their relationship and the delicate balance Chapuys had to maintain. Political fortunes changed again, and Chapuys found himself back in favor. The Imperial and French ambassadors united to protest taxes on foreign merchants, and the Privy Council members were more courteous to Chapuys than ever before. Norfolk, who had become cold and distant, now made a point of being friendly and attentive. This shift in behavior was a clear sign that Henry was deeply concerned about his relationship with the Emperor and the reputation of Charles V. The French ambassador, however, found himself in a similar position to Chapuys only weeks earlier. He had secured the release of a coin shaver and some pirates, and the English now openly mocked him. This series of events demonstrated the fragile nature of the relationships between the ambassadors and Henry, where a simple act by the king could mean the difference between being able to do one's duty or being locked out of court. As the year drew to a close, Chapuys reflected on the challenges he had faced. His unwavering support for Katherine and his skillful diplomacy had earned him the respect of many, but it had also made him a target. Despite the open hostility and the constant political maneuvering, Chapuys remained committed to his mission. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he was determined to continue serving both his master, Charles V, and the cause of Queen Katherine.